This Week with Bob Mueller on News 2.
This week, 45 years ago, the Waverly train disaster claimed 16 lives.
Nobody was sure how to clean up a wreck like that.
The author of Walk Through Fire, The Story of Waverly, details the tragedy.
We're already underfunding public education in the state of Tennessee.
Republican lawmakers want to reject $2 billion in federal education funding.
Let's refrain from rushing to surgical and medicinal therapies.
GOP lawmakers move forward with a ban on transgender medical therapy for minors.
To try to intimidate this committee to go a certain direction is uncalled for.
And bucking pro-life groups' exceptions to Tennessee's near-total abortion ban move forward. Hello again and welcome to another edition of This Week. Next week is the 45th anniversary of the Waverly train disaster that claimed 16 lives and changed America. More in our This Week cover story. You will also hear from the author of a book detailing this disaster, Walk Through Fire. But first, Republicans shun nearly $2 billion in federal education funds and move forward to ban transgender medical therapy for minors.
A transgender psychologist agreeing with a top Tennessee Republican.
Let's refrain from rushing to surgical and medicinal therapies that result in things that cannot be undone.
Clinical psychologist Dr. Erica Anderson has worked with hundreds of trans kids and says some providers are too quick to give medication to minors with gender dysmorphia.
TikTok videos where people say things like, if a child says they're trans, just give them the hormones. And I think that's a serious mistake. Historically, we haven't offered gender-affirming hormones unless someone's mental health issues are well controlled.
But she says the state Senate's vote to ban gender-affirming care for all trans minors is going too far in the other direction.
This bill protects minors from undergoing life-altering procedures that they might someday regret.
Let's put children first and look out for them first and let them make those decisions as adults.
But Anderson says making kids wait until they're older can be dangerous.
In some cases, it comes across as cruel to know of a treatment that might be beneficial and to withhold it from a child who needs it.
And she agrees with Democrats that this is a decision lawmakers should stay out of.
We are legislating many of our personal beliefs in a blanket ban on this medically necessary care.
One of the authors of the American Academy of Pediatrics guidance on gender-affirming care says there's a misconception about what trans care looks like for kids.
And the idea that gender-affirmative care is like blindly following whatever the child wants. And that by no means is what we recommend.
It says while this issue has come to an up or down vote, it's more complicated than that.
A lot of the nuance that we bring to each individual family is being clouded in black and white.
Tennessee Republican leaders introduced legislation to deny federal funding for education. Instead, they say the state would cover the difference, and Democrats are not happy. News 2's Chris O'Brien with a look at how this could impact you and your family.
Nearly $1.8 billion. That's how much the state may cough up if it chooses not to accept federal education dollars.
The state will pick up the cost and still fund those things, but we will be free of the federal regulations.
Speaker of the House Cameron Sexton says he's introduced a bill to decline federal education funding and instead replace it with state money.
If we can fund it ourselves and not have federal overreach coming in, why would we not do that?
Democrats say because it's nearly $2 billion in free money. And if we're just sitting on a surplus now, why not put that toward education and accept the federal dollars?
Think about what those dollars could be used for. We're already underfunding public education in the state of Tennessee.
Democrats also argue if the state declines the federal money, Tennesseans would be paying double. They'd pay state taxes that go toward education, and they'd pay federal taxes, though that federal money wouldn't be going to Tennessee and education.
That is completely fiscally irresponsible and jeopardizes the entire future of this state.
But Sexton says federal taxes don't go exclusively toward education.
It flows to roads, it can flow to other things. It doesn't necessarily mean it flows to education.
We did reach out to the U.S. Department of Education to see if it had a response. Its statement in part read, "This political posturing will impede the basic education of young people throughout the entire K-12 school system and limit opportunities, particularly for students most in need." In Nashville, Chris O'Brien.
President Joe Biden detailed information about those high-altitude objects recently shot down by U.S. fighter jets. Bipartisan congressional leaders have been calling for him to provide more details to the American people. ABC's Justin Finch with more.
Leaving his annual medical exam, President Biden asked about the 3 unidentified objects shot down by military fighter jets last weekend, along with that Chinese surveillance balloon downed almost 2 weeks ago in South Carolina.
I want to be clear. We don't have any evidence that there has been a sudden increase in the number of objects in the sky. We're now just seeing more of them, partially because the steps we've taken to increase our radars.
The president's remarks and the stricter enforcement over U.S. airspace follow several appeals from Democrats and Republicans for him to address the nation after closed-door congressional briefings on those objects last week.
The size of it, it's just so slow and so small and you can't see it.
That cockpit audio verified by the Air Force of F-16 fighter pilots tracking down the latest high-flying object before shooting it down with a missile over Lake Huron, Michigan, Sunday. That takedown following another over Canada's Yukon territory the day before, and one more off the Alaskan coast the day before that.
We don't yet know exactly what these 3 objects were, but nothing right now suggests they were related to China's spy balloon program or that they were surveillance vehicles from any other country.
Those incidents all coming after the U.S. shot down that Chinese spy balloon in waters off South Carolina February 4th.
Now to our This Week cover story, a slow-motion disaster 45 years ago. 24 cars of a 92-car Louisville and Nashville Railroad freight train derailed in Waverly. 2 days later, a derailed tanker filled with LP gas exploded.
It is considered a watershed event, one that changed history. On February 24, 1978, a train derailment just west of Nashville in the town of Waverly commanded the attention of numerous police and fire crews.
In that derailment was 2 tank cars of liquid propane gas in that wreckage. The wreckage laid there all that night. The next day on Thursday, it was a cold day. We had the snow on the ground on Thursday. The tanks did show some damage. There was no leaks of any product at all at that time. Friday, on the 24th of February 1978, weather turned very spring-like in Tennessee,
causing the tanks to expand, igniting a massive explosion, shooting fire into the air.
Most of the people were either incapacitated completely or some were on fire and running. One man had his clothes burned off and was running to the creek.
16 people died, among them the city's police chief and fire chief. Nearly 100 people were injured.
I have some of the best friends that I ever had got killed in the disaster.
The impact reached far beyond Middle Tennessee. The event triggered nationwide changes in how hazardous materials are transported. The memories are still painful for those who lived through it, but there is purpose in taking time to remember.
Really, sometimes we have to think about those things as bad to kind of keep everything in perspective, I guess, really.
Stay with us. This Week continues in a moment. Welcome back to This Week. I am pleased to be joined by Dr. Yasmin Ali. She is the author of Walk Through Fire, the train disaster that changed America. Welcome. Thank you very much for your time. It's really nice meeting you.
You too. Thank you so much for having me. I am thrilled to be on this show.
That train disaster that changed America was the 1978 explosion in Waverly, Tennessee that claimed 16 lives. This is a personal story to you. You lived in Waverly as a child. Your parents were doctors the day of this disaster. You wrote this book. It tells the story. Talk a little bit about the experience that these people went through. It was a 2-day slow-moving disaster, as it were. The train derailed on the 22nd. The explosion happened 2 days later. And so many mistakes were made, but mistakes that people didn't know about because they didn't know what they were dealing with.
That's exactly right. The train derailed on a Wednesday night around 10:30 p.m. and it was 23 train cars just wrecked in the middle of Waverly. And among them were 2 propane tankers.
Right.
So 30,000 gallons of liquid propane in each tanker. And
that they thought was anhydrous ammonia.
They thought was anhydrous ammonia because that's how the tankers were labeled. So they did not know it was propane in those tankers. And when the cleanup efforts were ongoing. Friday afternoon, 2:55 p.m., February 24th, 1978, that propane tanker, one of them, exploded. And the response of the people on the ground and the ability of that tiny rural hospital to deal with that many patients and burn victims in such a short amount of time was really just extraordinary, given the resources that they had.
As terrible as that disaster was, it's truly a miracle it wasn't worse. In that, as the accident happened, and you said the response was, it was local response, there was no FEMA, that became an agency that came out of this disaster. People were doing the best they could, but there were people milling around the disaster site, in the wreckage. There was a cordoned off area, but was only 12 feet or so away. The tanker sat there for 2 days. It looked fine. Everybody thought it was secure. The weather was cold, then it warmed up. The tank swelled, causing the explosion. You write about that day, the explosion that happened that day, and that ball of fire, and it's vivid. You write this blue wall of waterish flame engulfing the city, engulfing these poor victims, killing some instantly and others surviving with just horrific injuries. Your mother and father, gastrointestinalist, your mother, a surgeon, your father. Your mother is on duty. Your father's at another hospital when this happens. Your mother starts dealing with the trauma cases. Your father is on the way. And the description of the triage, it's very hard to read. I'm sure it was hard to write.
It was very difficult to write because of the nature of the tragedy and because I knew those people personally. You know, these are people who had told me their stories. And as I was writing it, it was very emotional. And I'll be honest with you, there were times when I had to stop and cry when I was writing those scenes because they were so horrific. But everyone who told me their story was clear that they wanted it told in detail. They wanted other people to know what they went through. They didn't want to be just a statistic, which is what we so often hear with disasters. We don't get to know the personal side of things. And so I thought that was important to tell. And so within an hour, that 160 square foot emergency room triaged 40 patients.
It's amazing.
And we're able to get them out in that crucial first hour.
You talked to your parents. Obviously, they dealt with these things, 3rd and even 4th degree burns and skin falling off of these people. This is 45 years ago. Burn therapy wasn't as good as it is now. They did the most they could, but everything was horrific pain for these people. Changing bandages was pain for these people. Talk a little bit about the efforts your parents went through just to try to save these people's lives.
Sure. So my father had training as a trauma surgeon, and he had been drafted in Vietnam, so he got some training in the Army Reserve for mass casualty events.
And this was like a mass unit.
And this was like a mass casualty event. So he says he just went on autopilot, and the nurses and many of the medical staff will tell you the same thing. They just went into autopilot because that hospital had the foresight to have a disaster plan, which a lot of places didn't at that time. And they had done a mock disaster drill a week before.
Wow.
Just the coincidence of it. And so they just went into their training mode. But my father tells the story of trying to get intravenous access in these burn patients. And one of the things you have to do immediately for burn patients is fluid resuscitation. Get lots of fluid into them because they are losing all of that fluid. They're losing their
swelling
skin.
up.
And everything's And it's hard to find a vein. It's hard for a nurse to get it. It's hard for most doctors to get it. But he had surgical training and was able to get what's called a subclavian line, which is under the clavicle. It's really hard to find. I've done it myself, and it's not easy. But to do it in a burn victim where you really can't tell where the landmarks are, he went through and victim after victim stuck the vein, got them IV access, and didn't miss a single stick. And when he looks back on it later, he can't believe that. He says there must have been a higher power guiding his hands that day for him to be able to do that.
Your father took charge. He called Fort Campbell. Helicopters were sent from Fort Campbell to move people to burn units in Birmingham, Cincinnati, Nashville, Memphis, all over the place.
Yes.
So this was an active scene for hours as you're trying to transport these patients.
It was. It absolutely was. And they had to get the most critically injured patients out to the hospitals in Nashville first. And then the mayor of Waverly at the time, Jimmy Powers, asked President Carter for a U.S. Air Force medevac plane to move them around the country to the larger burn centers, as you say, in Birmingham and Cincinnati. And it remained active for about 24 hours.
the people battling this disaster and trying to fight through this disaster, a lot of them sacrificed their lives. You lost the police chief, you lost the fire chief on the scene. As the explosion happened, they were there trying to protect the city. So many buildings were destroyed. It was a war scene.
It was, and that's how people describe it. It was like a war scene, and they described the tank blowing up like an atomic bomb. That was the analogy they used.
Everything that's terrible, usually and thankfully, something good comes out of. These people did not die in vain. Because of this terrible tragedy, their lives are remembered for vast improvements in how railroad transports hazardous materials, vast improvements in keeping tracks up to date and train cars up to date so that there isn't derailment from rusty and falling apart equipment. FEMA was formed out of this, Federal Emergency Management Agency, to respond to disasters. So in many ways, this terrible, terrible tragedy has a wonderful legacy of saving so many other lives in other tragedies.
Absolutely, absolutely. So many of the rail safety changes we take for granted today came out of what happened in Waverly. How train wheels are made, what they're made of, how the train is connected, and what those parts have to, the standards they have to meet, how tankers that carry hazardous materials are made and regulated, how they're insulated, how they're labeled so we don't have liquid propane in tankers labeled for anhydrous ammonia, that sort of thing. And then, you know, there was a lot of legislation that came out of what happened in Waverly. Then our governor at the time, Ray Blanton, was there in Waverly that night when the fires were burning. 1980, he established the Tennessee Hazardous Materials Institute. That came out of the lessons from that disaster. And the Tennessee Hazardous Materials Institute has had programs that have been models for the entire country for training firefighters and hazmat handlers. So this has gone a long way.
A lot of people who went through this, a lot of towns maybe that went through this would want to forget about it. Yeah. So people of Waverly, they memorialize the people who sacrificed themselves. There's a monument there. They want to tell this story because some good did come out of it.
Yes, absolutely. And the mayor of Waverly now is Buddy Frazier. He was a police officer at the time. He was the first person on the scene of the train derailment. And he will tell you, and his story is in the book, and he will tell you that if anything good came out of that disaster, it was the lessons that were learned, and no telling how many lives have been saved since that disaster.
When you look at the Waverly disaster, what is the legacy? What is the thing that people will remember? Not only the resiliency of this town to get through this, but now, 2 years ago, the resiliency of this town to get through another major disaster, the flood that hit Waverly and caused the death of more than 20 people. It's hard to believe a small town like this can be hit by two major disasters like this and still survive, come out of it, and be resilient.
I think you hit the nail on the head there, resilient. I think that is what strikes me about the people of Waverly, about my hometown, is their resiliency, how they always come together in times of crisis. You know, when I look at the Waverly train disaster, what strikes me is that it was a triumph of community over chaos and what we can do when we come together.
As you get ready to release your book, Walk Through Fire, comes out in a couple of days, I think.
February 21st.
All right. As people read your book and understand, and maybe for the first time read the story of Waverly, what do you want them to take away from it?
I want them to focus on the people who were there. That's what I tried to get across more than anything, the people's stories and what they went through.
And the people are very vivid and they're very real in this story, and they're very brave.
Yes, absolutely. They're heroes.
Dr. Yasmin Ali, appreciate your time very much. The book is Walk Through Fire. It comes out on February 24th. Get a copy. It is a quick read and a really important read. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Stay with us. This week continues in a moment. Welcome back. An anti-abortion group threatens lawmakers for considering exceptions to Tennessee's near-total abortion ban. Speaker of the House Cameron Sexton accused the group of intimidation. State Capitol Newsroom reporter Chris O'Brien has more.
When a Tennessee Right to Life lobbyist and legal advisor told legislators the organization would poorly score a bill to potentially add some leeway in the current abortion ban, Speaker Cameron Sexton took exception.
To do it in the committee, to try to intimidate this committee to go a certain direction, is uncalled for.
Sexton, who isn't a member of the committee, came down during the meeting and condemned the move from the anti-abortion group.
To say that in committee, I've never experienced before. I thought it was over the top. It was more to in my opinion, as I said in committee, to intimidate members.
The move is an unusual one for the House's top Republican and marked common ground between the two parties.
Making political campaign threats during testimony on a health care bill or any bill in this body is really disrespectful and beyond the pale and inappropriate.
Of course, Democrats want to pull the whole law back, but as a superminority, their hands are fairly tied.
And compromise is necessary to achieve any level of progress. And so in the spirit of bipartisanship and really trying to find some common ground, we supported that legislation, and I hope it does pass.
Still, Sexton's public rebuke did mark one important note. It makes the possibility of exceptions for the current law much higher than previously thought.
I'm acceptable with rape and incest. That doesn't mean that's what we're going to pass.
But with the Speaker's support, it seems much more likely. In Nashville, Chris O'Brien.
Stay with us. This Week continues in a moment. Thanks for spending part of your weekend with us. That will do it for another edition of This Week. I do want to thank my guest, Dr. Yasmin Ali, author of Walk Through Fire, the story of the Waverly train disaster. Hope to see you back here next weekend for another edition of This Week, and you have a great week.